we're starting off with this piece by Greg Dickinson, which, as you may have noticed, is published in 2002. So that's a little while ago now. But I've been teaching this essay for years. I came across this piece when I was a young assistant professor. I first got to UNLV. That was back in 2004. And I think I found another piece by Greg around that time, and I just fell in love with it because it's very close to a lot of the work that I do on space. So Greg Dickinson is a scholar at the University of Colorado, Fort Collins, and he's been writing about space and materiality, mostly space, for many years, and he's a leading voice in this area. He's written about like museum spaces, and he's written about like suburban spaces and revitalized urban spaces, and he's really interested in sort of the rhetoricity of space. Okay, so we'll get more into like what that means. But in terms of the shift from last week's stuff on epistemology, and then before that, was the week on the 20th century stuff, I guess the question is like, where are we headed and how does the one build on the other, right? Now, epistemologically speaking, last week was all about this question of knowledge and contingency, right? The idea that our truths can evolve, they can change, they can be different over here than they are over there, and that poses interesting unique challenges and opportunities for rhetoric, right? So that was kind of the focus of last week. This week, this turn into space and materiality and affect. The way that I think maybe we should approach this is getting back to the line from the Kenneth Burke essay Definition of Man, where he talks about language. He says, do we use words, or do words not also use us? I don't know if you remember that moment, but it's early in his piece where he's talking about basically the power of language, or the power of communication. With Burke, he's interested in the world of the symbolic more broadly, not just words or language specifically, but symbols, which takes us beyond language, takes us to colors and shapes and images and so on. So that whole world of symbolism is the world that Burke was interested in. But he made the really astute observation that we don't just create symbols also create us, right? So do we use words, or do words not also use us? That's a powerful idea. If you're just walking around and you encounter some symbolism, it can really affect you. If you see an image of a crying baby on the border, right? That doesn't have to be any words involved there, but it arouses certain kinds of moods and potentially action and so on. So that's how I think we should approach this week's readings. When we separate language or symbolism from the humans that create it, and if we grant that the realm of the symbolic, which is very broad, and encompasses, like I said, shapes, colors, potentially even sounds, smells, right? Now we're in this vast world of influence. And what Dickinson's zeroing in on here is this idea that like we move through these spaces in our everyday lives, whether it's coffee shops or grocery stores, or like, I don't know, like a stadium or a park or a mall. I mean, scholars have been writing about these kind of everyday spaces for a while. So Dickinson is bringing his rhetorical critical sensibilities into a consideration of everyday spaces, right? And what's more of an everyday space than Starbucks? Even back in 2002, he was writing that Starbucks was enormous, and it continues to just sort of, it serves an important kind of function in just the daily life of Western society. So it's a great way, a great vehicle to be thinking about everyday symbolism and how that exists within specific kinds of spaces, right? So, and then the next video we'll look at affect sensation. That's more specifically thinking about kind of the felt experience of moving through spaces. So that's more interested in like the body itself. And then the last piece on materiality, there I'm talking about food and taste and so on. So it's about the hardness of the sort of the physical material side of things, and how that is an important part of rhetorical influence. So what to point out with Dickinson, I attached this little note sheet that I had kicking around. It's just sort of like, these are some of the key points here. There's a couple of just broad, important themes of this essay. I don't think it's terribly tricky. piece if you kind of get the basics of like what's he like how is this rhetorical, right? Don't forget all of the readings that we're encountering right now, they fall into this sophistic or neo-sophistic model, right? And the neo-sophistic model is all about the power of language as such, and in this case extend that idea to think about the power of symbolism as such, and that can be anywhere. Think about the symbolism that you experience when you go to oh, I love going to this store. The Bass Pro Shop. It's at the Silverton Casino. It's like, think about the symbolism there versus the symbolism at like Whole Foods, for instance. You're getting this whole kind of immersive experience. And the point that Dickinson's making is even if this isn't like deliberately constructed as a piece of rhetoric, it's still rhetorical because it has an impact. It impacts the people who exist there, and it compels them to come, right? I can tell you from having traveled all over the eastern part of this planet, east to us, I guess, China, Vietnam, Singapore, and so on, India, like Starbucks is so important when you are in parts of the world that are uncomfortable and different and strange. Like when you see that Starbucks, you're just like, oh my goodness, thank you, thank you, thank you, right? So it's powerful. It has appeal. And when things have appeal in this way, then you can talk about the rhetoric that underwrites that appeal. So right off the bat, Dickinson, he's a friend, so I call him Greg. He's talking about everydayness and materiality and daily habits. So right there, this is sort of the idea that rhetoric is going big, that we talked about with the Condit and Lucchese stuff, this idea of rhetoric's going bigger and bigger in the 20th century. Here it's going so big that we can talk about sort of everydayness, right? The rhetoric of everydayness. You wake up, you go to the coffee shop, there's rhetoricality that's happening just in that quick little decision. Why do you go to this coffee shop versus that coffee shop? They just opened a Bad Owl on Rainbow, which is close to where I live. You guys ever been to Bad Owl Coffee? So we're all excited. We love going to coffee shops in my family. So there we go. We're going to Bad Owl, and we're sitting there, and we're like, my soon-to-be wife is an architect, so we always focus on design and the aesthetics and so on. We have great fun critiquing everything. We're very attuned to sort of the way that things affect and influence and appeal and so on. And the argument that Dickinson's making is that even if words and speech are not a part of this experience, it's still influencing us and therefore rhetorical and important to think about. So he's talking about stuff that we seldom pay attention to. So everydayness is important, and then this other idea of the unconscious. Now, Burke was the first one, I think, in the 20th century big folks to talk about the unconscious way that rhetoric moves us. So again, when he talks about do we use words or do words not also use us, the unconscious is an important part of that question. This idea of words using us without being aware of it, right? We can be influenced in ways that we're not always aware of. Or even sort of just barely conscious of or whatever. But he's interested in sort of the ways that we make choices and are drawn to things in ways that maybe we're not fully aware of or that, appeals to the unconscious. So that's an important development here. So that's what he means by non-discursive text. You can think of a text beyond just that which has words or speech or whatever. So you can think of a coffee shop as a text because it has appeals. It's using symbolism. It's conveying values. It's saying to people who go there, this is the kind of person you are. It's very much like the second persona in that way, right? It's crafting an image of who it thinks wants to be here. And then when we go there, we're basically saying, yes, I am the kind of person who wants to go to Starbucks. Starbucks used to be more narrow. It used to be more like, West Coast, liberal, elite, connoisseur, and so on. It's like if you went to Starbucks, it's because you cared about your coffee. Now it's kind of like, it's changed a lot. I feel like Starbucks has become a candy shop, basically. It blows me away. It's just like a side note. It blows me away when I go to Starbucks in the morning and I see the person in front of me in the drive-thru and they're getting like their 5 milkshakes and the sundaes with the whipped cream and the strawberry. It's like, is this coffee or is this Willy Wonka's? I don't know. Anyway. So it's interesting to see how it's changed. And I'd be interested to see if he rewrote this today, how he might approach this differently. So let's see here. Point number 6 here, he says, Starbucks is helping solve a problem. Now, Greg writes a lot of his pieces from this same kind of perspective, which is to say we live in this postmodern world where our most fundamental truth structures, whether it be nation or the church and God or community or whatever, these narratives have crumbled, and there's really nothing that grounds us all, like as a total kind of society. We don't all accept this overarching story about meaning and coherence and order and so on. So we live in this fragmented postmodern world where, a belief in God is as meaningful as a belief in, the Las Vegas Knights or something like this. Everything's just kind of like a choice, right? So his point is like we're disoriented. This postmodern subject, which is me, it's you, it's all of us. We are subjects of this postmodern moment that we're in. We're all kind of like a cork on the ocean, just bobbing around, looking for something to kind of grasp onto and find meaning in. His point is that Starbucks gives us that sense of meaning and being like anchored, right? So someone who's interested in space, we're kind of floating around, we're traveling, we can hop on a plane, we can be in China tomorrow or this afternoon, we can go wherever we want for super cheap, and it creates this sense of disconnection and sort of wandering, aimlessly and sort of lost and alienated and so on. He's saying that Starbucks gives us, it's almost like a church a little bit. It gives us a feeling of rootedness and a sense of identity and a sense of connectedness. And a big part of his analysis is how it does that through these appeals to the natural and the authentic, right? So he gives us a really good critical reading of the space of Starbucks. He looks at the colors, the shapes, the imagery, some of the messages, right? And he sort of looks at it as a total experience, and that's the rhetoric, right? So you walk into Starbucks and you are swept up by this non-discursive wave of appeals that says to you, you are an authentic place, you're in a real place, a natural place, a place that cares about community, a place that cares about farmers, cares about employees, cares. Very kind of liberal set of ethics in that regard, right? And the point being that the rhetoric of Starbucks works very effectively to give us a sense of grounding and placeness. It helps us place ourselves, right? So he says, number 8 here, few places work harder to at once contain and exploit the cultural strains of fragmentation than Starbucks. So it sort of takes advantage of the fact that he argues people feel fragmented. They feel lost and dislocated and disconnected, and coffee shops is where we find each other. It's where we connect and do work and create, this sense of meaning and wholeness. Now, I think his best stuff in here is like the riff on green on page 13 and 14. He gives a brilliant analysis of just the color of green and what it associates with and connotes. It's wonderful. It's delightful. It's really great. He's a great critic and a great writer. But the point that I think you want to take away with his sort of critique of authenticity. Now, the point here is like not that Starbucks gives us actual authenticity. Excuse me. It obviously doesn't give us real nature, but it taps into a rhetoric of authenticity and a rhetoric of the natural. It's very easy to argue that authenticity doesn't actually exist and nature itself doesn't actually exist. Like, where is it? I don't know. Where does it start? Where does it end? I don't know. What's authentic when everything is borrowed and, recycled? And it's like, where do you find real authenticity? Those are like weird philosophical questions, and they don't even matter. The point is that Starbucks is very effective at sort of exploiting and capitalizing on rhetorics of authenticity and rhetorics of the natural. So regardless of what nature is or what it isn't and so on, we have these kinds of warm associations with an idea of authenticity or with an idea of the natural. And Starbucks is very good at sort of at packaging those ideas, right? If you're here, it's because you care about what's natural. You care about what's authentic. It's hogwash, but it's effective rhetoric. I think even the Starbucks and the Student Union here, when you go in there, there's like on the little cork board where it's like community events. I think they still have some imagery of like it's always black and white, and it's like the farmers in the fields in the third world country where the coffee comes from, and the idea being like we care about the farmers who grow your beans, like we're real and authentic and we care about nature. Now, what the truth value of those, actual truth of those statements is less important than what they're trying to tap into in terms of the audience, right? That's the key point here about the rhetoric. So he does a really nice job of showing that. Yeah, so he talks about the sort of the ritualistic nature of Starbucks and how it gives us a sense of meaning. I think the age of the article is showing itself at this point, because it used to be you'd go to Starbucks and they used to actually have beans that they would grind. You used to hear the grinding, and you could actually like buy fresh beans and you could see them, and it was all about like back when fresh roasted beans was like a huge thing, and you would go in and you would be a connoisseur and you'd be like, I want it done this way with this and this and this. Now it's much more automated, and it's actually, I think, less about the coffee and more about the specialty drinks and the food and all the rest of it. But really good piece of criticism here, and sort of thinking about the appeal of Starbucks and what it provides for us, right? So that's kind of the important stuff to think about here. His analysis of what it is that Starbucks is offering its consumers, its customers, its loyal return. I mean, I go to Starbucks all the time. I don't know that everything he's saying still holds up quite as accurately as it once did, just because the institution of Starbucks has changed so much. But as a piece of rhetorical criticism of everyday rhetoric that we find all around us, you could do the same of, again, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods. In fact, the reason I know Greg Dickinson's work is because I was going through a book and I found a chapter that he written about this grocery store that no longer exists because Whole Foods bought it. It used to be called Wild Oats Market, and it was kind of like Trader Joe's, and he did this wonderful analysis of this market, and again, the kind of second persona that this market gives its shoppers. To go there is to say, I am the kind of person who blank, cares about blank, values blank, wants blank, identifies with blank, right? So all of that process of appealing to consumers in that way, that's the rhetoric. So hopefully that works and makes sense. I think it's a wonderful piece. I still love teaching it and talking about it. And Greg's one of my favorite guys in the academy. He's a brilliant guy. He's a sweetheart. He's like 8 feet tall. He's always every time I go to a conference, it's easy to see Greg. You just look up and there he is. And I love him, and I love teaching his stuff. So hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in a moment when we talk about affect and sensation.